There was a man who ruled over Greeks, Egyptians, Babylonians, and Persians at the same time, without any of them feeling like they had lost their dignity. A man who conquered the known world, and yet didn't call it his, he called it theirs. No conqueror in history had ever thought that way, and yet it happened. And the empire that man built became the greatest civilization the world had ever seen up to that point. A colossus that connected 3 continents, that created a way of governing we still use today without even realizing it, and that gave birth to what we now know as Iran. This is the story of the Persian Empire. It all began in a place that doesn't look like the ideal setting to found an empire. The lands of what is now Iran, 2,600 years ago, were a chaotic mix of peoples, tribes, and small kingdoms fighting each other over scarce resources in a territory full of mountains and deserts. There lived the Medes, who had built a respectable kingdom in the northwest. And there lived the Persians, a related group of people settled further south in a region they called Persis. This would be the modern-day Fars in Iran. The Persians were people defined by their pride and warrior spirit. But at that moment they were subjects of the Medes. They paid tribute, they obeyed, they endured. What no one expected was that from that subjugated people would rise the man who would change everything. His name was Cyrus. Before I tell you of his deeds, we must first understand the world he inhabited. The world of the 6th century before Christ was a world of brutal empires. Assyria had left such a deep mark of terror on the collective memory of the Near East that centuries later, people still trembled at the mention of its name. Babylon was a cultural and military powerhouse that crushed its enemies and deported entire populations to erase their identity. The Medes had destroyed Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, with a ferocity that shocked everyone. That's how the world worked. You conquered, you destroyed, you humiliated, you dragged people away in chains. It was the unquestioned norm, the only life they could imagine. And then Cyrus arrived. Cyrus the Great rose to the throne of Persis around 559 before Christ. He was young, brilliant, and he had something his contemporaries couldn't quite understand. A way of seeing power that didn't fit anything the world had seen before. For him, ruling didn't mean destroying. It meant weaving different cultures together. He didn't crush his enemies. He turned them into allies. He didn't erase the traditions he conquered. He preserved them. Sometimes he even funded them. If that sounds like an exaggeration, just wait until you see how he treated the crown jewel of the ancient world, Babylon. His journey started with a rebellion against the dominance of the Median kings, something that many considered a political suicide. The Medes were stronger, more numerous, and backed by regional powers. Cyrus, on the other side, was the king of a small kingdom, daring to challenge the dominant force of the region. And what no one expected was that the Median army itself would switch sides halfway through the campaign. The Median king, Astyages, described in the chronicles as so arrogant he had alienated his own generals, suddenly found himself without an army and without a crown. Cyrus took Ecbatana, the Median capital, in 550 before Christ, and to everyone's surprise, he didn't destroy it. He didn't execute Astyages, even though he had every reason to. He treated him like a defeated king, but not a humiliated one. And here lies the first haunting question this story forces us to face. What makes a man with all the power to destroy choose to build instead? Was it just cold political calculation? Was it a radical, genuine conviction? Or was it something that even now remains to be understood? Let that question linger. After the Medes came the Lydians. Croesus was the king of Lydia, which is known as the modern-day Turkey. Croesus was one of the richest men in the ancient world. His wealth was so vast it gave birth to the expression rich as Croesus, and it's not an exaggeration. Lydia was one of the first places in history to mint coins, and Croesus had accumulated a fortune that made every other ruler look, let's say, fairly modest by comparison. Before facing Cyrus, Croesus consulted the famous Oracle of Delphi. The oracle told him that if he crossed the Halys River to attack Persia, he would destroy a great empire. Croesus took this as a promise of victory, and the oracle was right. He just misunderstood one small detail. A great empire did fall that day, but it wasn't Cyrus's. It was his own. The campaign was fast, brutal, and decisive. The fate of Lydia was decided at the Battle of Thymbra. It was here in 547 before Christ that Cyrus faced the massive Lydian army on an open plain, proving that gold was no match for Persian steel. Around this time, when Croesus was captured and about to be executed on a burning pyre, Cyrus chose mercy. He spared him. Not only did he do that, but he kept him by his side as an advisor for years. The richest man in the world, who was bound to be defeated and humiliated, became instead the trusted voice of the king who conquered his own empire. In a world ruled by blood and vengeance, this was unheard of. Mercy was not a virtue of kings, until Cyrus, of course. Throughout his conquests, what comes next is the real meat of the story. Babylon, the most imposing city of the ancient world. 1,700 years of history, hanging gardens and massive walls, so wide, according to Herodotus, that 2 chariots could pass each other at the same time on top. The famous Tower of Babel, a monument of stone and pride piercing the very clouds. Its astronomy, its literature, and its medicine. Babylon wasn't just a city. It was the center of the fucking world, and to no one's surprise, in 539 before Christ, it was conquered by Cyrus. However, what came next was the real surprise. After the fall of the great city, not a single temple was destroyed, no looting was reported, and no massacre took place. Cyrus entered Babylon not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. He bowed before Marduk, the supreme Babylonian god. He announced that the gods of Babylon would not be touched. And then he did something that had no precedent in ancient history. He freed all the peoples the Babylonians had deported and kept in captivity, including the Jews, the same people who had spent decades in the so-called Babylonian exile, longing for Jerusalem, praying for someone to take them home. Cyrus freed them. He returned the sacred objects that had been taken from the Temple of Solomon. He financed the rebuilding of the temple. And then he just left. In the book of Isaiah, in the Bible, Cyrus is called the Anointed One, the Messiah, the only foreign ruler in the entire biblical tradition to receive that title. A Persian king who didn't worship the God of Israel, hailed as a divine instrument by Hebrew prophets. And of course, that didn't happen by accident. It happened because Cyrus did something no conqueror before him had ever done. He treated the conquered people as human beings with dignity. And that brings us back to the question. Was Cyrus a political genius who realized that ruling with benevolence was more effective than ruling with terror? Or was there something deeper, maybe a genuine belief in human dignity that set him apart from every other ruler of his time? The truth of the matter is, we still don't know. The accounts of Cyrus's death oftentimes vary, but Herodotus tells us a story. He says that Queen Tomyris, whose son had died in a trap set by the Persians, defeated Cyrus's army. After the battle, she searched for Cyrus's body among the dead, and once she found it, she placed his head into a container filled with blood and said, "Drink your fill of blood, since you were never satisfied." Whether it is legend or history, we may never truly know, But what we do know is that Cyrus died in a battle around 530 before Christ, fighting the nomadic people of Central Asia, and what his successors inherited was something the world had never seen before, a state that stretched from the Indus River in the east to the Mediterranean in the west, from the Caucasus in the north to Nubia in the south. 3 continents connected under a single administration with a network of roads, a communication system so efficient that it left the Greeks in awe. As Herodotus wrote, neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness stops these messengers from completing their journey. Those very same words are now inscribed on the main building of the United States Postal Service in New York. Cyrus's son Cambyses expanded the empire even further. In 525 before Christ, he conquered Egypt, became pharaoh, and added the Nile to an already enormous empire. But it was the next great king, Darius I, who transformed this vast territory into something far more sophisticated. He divided the empire into satrapies, provinces governed by local rulers who answered to the king but kept their own laws, customs, and traditions. He also standardized weights and measures across the empire, created a unified legal system, and established Aramaic as the administrative language, which allowed completely different cultures to communicate within the same structure. He built Persepolis, one of the most impressive ceremonial cities of the ancient world, connected the Nile to the Red Sea through a canal 2,500 fucking years before the Suez Canal would be imagined. This wasn't just an empire anymore, it was a system, a machine designed to govern diversity at scale. And yet, Darius is also connected to one of the most famous failures in Persian history. One failure the Greeks would tell for centuries as their greatest triumph: the Greco-Persian Wars. In 490 before Christ, the Persian army crossed the Aegean Sea and landed on the plain of Marathon, about 40 kilometers from Athens. What happened there is still today well known. Outnumbered, the Athenians defeated the Persian army in one of the most influential battles in Western history. After the battle, a messenger ran 40 kilometers to Athens to announce the victory, and sadly died of exhaustion upon arrival. That moment gave its name to a race that millions of people run today, without knowing exactly why. But here's something most history books don't emphasize enough. Marathon was a tactical defeat for Persia, not a strategic disaster. At that moment, the Persian Empire controlled more than half of the known world, and Greece was a peripheral region, a collection of small, constantly fighting city-states. Darius died before launching a second invasion, and his son Xerxes carried it out 10 years later, with an army that ancient sources describe in numbers modern historians consider exaggerated. But even the most conservative estimates agree. It was absolutely massive. Xerxes burned Athens. The city had been evacuated, but he destroyed it anyway. And still, the impossible happened. Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans and their allies held the hot gates of hell against a 1,000,000-man empire, buying Greece the time it needed with their blood. Salamis, where the Persian fleet was lured into a trap, watched by Xerxes himself as his dreams of conquest sank into the sea. And finally Plataea, the decisive blow that shattered the Persian invasion, forcing the remnants of the great king's army to retreat into Asia, defeated and broken. Greece was never conquered, but there's a part of the story that rarely makes it into the history books: the aftermath. Xerxes went back to Persepolis and lived for 21 more years, ruling over the largest empire in the world. The wars with Greece were just an episode in a much bigger story. When Aeschylus wrote a play called The Persians, one of the earliest surviving tragedies, he didn't portray them as monsters. He portrayed them as human beings, regular people who suffered the consequences of their king's ambition. The Persian Empire lasted over 200 years, from Cyrus to its conquest by Alexander the Great in 330 before Christ. When Alexander reached Persepolis, he burned it to the ground. Some say it was cold, calculated revenge for the burning of Athens a century and a half before. Others say it was a drunken mistake, one he would come to regret for the rest of his life. But here's the part that matters. Alexander was so deeply impressed by Persian civilization that he adopted it entirely, proving that while empires may burn, their ideas are immortal. He wore Persian clothing, married a Persian princess. He tried to fuse Greek and Persian cultures into something entirely new, much to the detriment of his generals who simply couldn't understand it. But Alexander had realized something Cyrus already knew. The empires that last are not the ones that destroy what they find, but those that allow themselves to be transformed by what they conquer. And the Persian legacy didn't just end with Alexander. Centuries later, the Parthians revived the Iranian tradition. Then the Sassanids built a second Persian empire that lasted 4 more centuries. They rivaled Rome and Byzantium, preserved Greek philosophy when Europe had forgotten it, and became the dominant power of the Near East until the rise of Islam. And even then, Persia didn't disappear. Its language, culture, and identity survived. Persian civilization didn't just survive its conquerors, it colonized their minds. It went on to produce giants who would redefine the boundaries of human knowledge. Avicenna, the master physician whose canon of medicine became the supreme authority of healing for 6 centuries. Rumi, the mystic poet whose verses of universal love still serve as the anthem for the human soul across every border. Omar Khayyam, the polymath who measured the heavens with mathematical precision while capturing the fragile beauty of life in his poetry. These men were the harvest of a culture that refused to be erased. Today, modern Iran, with all its political complexity and all its contradictions, still carries the same root in its name. The land of the Aryans, the people who emerged from a mountainous corner of the world and built the first serious attempt at governing human diversity with something resembling respect. But perhaps the most striking proof of this isn't found in a history book, but in a single, quiet detail. See, in the British Museum in London, there is a glass case. Inside it lies a clay cylinder, about 23 centimeters long, covered in cuneiform writing. The Cyrus cylinder, 2,500 years old. And in that cylinder, a king who ruled the largest empire of his time wrote, "No people should be forced to abandon their gods, their language, or their customs, that the inhabitants of conquered lands deserve to live in peace, that he, the king, was there to protect them, not to dominate them." We don't know if he always lived up to those words. We don't even know if it was either strategy or conviction. But what we do know is that in a world ruled by blood and mass enslavement, it was unprecedented upon his time. And still today, a replica of that cylinder stands at the United Nations in New York as a reminder that true power isn't found in how much we can conquer, but in how much we are willing to protect.